But we're going to continue in our study this morning in Ecclesiastes. We come to another one of those passages that King Solomon likes to address. It's this idea of money. And he talks about it a lot in this book, doesn't he? I think that's for a very specific reason. That reason being that money is something that plagues most of us. It's something we struggle with throughout life. How do we use the resources that God has entrusted to us? How do we use them in a way that glorifies Him? How do we use them in a way that they don't become the focus of our own lives? God never intended for us to be focused on the pursuit of wealth. It's necessary to earn a living, but it shouldn't be the focus of our life. And so Solomon keeps making these cycles where he visits the same subjects over and over again. He deals with wisdom, he deals with wealth, he deals with work, and he seems to make these cycles where they come back around and he takes another look at it from a different angle. And anytime you see repetition in God's Word, it's important for us to recognize that this is something God wants us to pay attention to. He didn't just forget where he was earlier and come back to it and revisit again, but he's reinforcing certain points so that we don't miss them. And if you're anything like me, you might have a tendency to forget some of the things that we learn here on Sunday mornings. And so sometimes it's good to take another look at those things and remember how those truths apply in our lives. So we're going to take another look at wealth today, and specifically the pursuit of it. But I want to begin with a little story. The story is told of a wealthy businessman who happened to be walking down the wharf one day, and he encountered a fisherman sitting on the dock next to his boat, with his feet lazily placed up on a bench next to him, with his hat pulled down, and he was taking a nap. Well, the businessman was obviously offended at such a thing, kicked the man's chair and asked him, "Why aren't you out fishing?" And the man says, "I caught enough fish for today, that's why." "But there's still daylight left. You could be out fishing and catch more fish. Why aren't you out catching more fish?" He said, "Well, I've caught enough for today." He says, "But you could earn more money. And if you earned more money, then you could buy a bigger boat. And you could go further out into the ocean, and you could fish deeper in the waters. You could buy bigger nets and catch even more fish." And the man says, "Well, what would be the point of all that?" "Well, then you would have more money. And then you could buy a fleet of boats, and then you could fish all over the place." And the fisherman says, "Well, what would be the point of all of that?" He says, "Well, then you could relax and enjoy life like I do." And the fisherman looked around and he says, "What do you think I'm doing right now?" Illustrates for us a pretty important point. That oftentimes we have a tendency to believe that we need to work harder, get to another level, and then when we reach that level, whatever it may be, and of course that's always a subjective one, when we reach that level, then we can relax and enjoy life. What the fisherman illustrates for us is we should enjoy life every day, because every day is a gift of God. Every day is an act of the grace of God shown to a people like us who are incredibly undeserving of that grace. God has provided all that we need. And if we can learn to be content with what God has provided, it will eliminate a lot of the struggles of life for us. Rather than scratching and scraping and fighting to get ahead and to make more money so that we can buy more things or more stuff or whatever it is, shouldn't we take a step back and be content and enjoy the things that God has already provided? Wouldn't that be a whole lot easier than the hamster wheel of life that so many of us are treading on day in and day out? That's the point that Solomon wants to make in this text for us this morning. That don't go through the struggle, but instead be content with what God has already provided. Wealth doesn't always bring happiness, does it? Wealth often brings more responsibilities and more work than happiness that it produces. Oftentimes we get into this struggle where we're working harder and harder and harder, and we think that we're getting ahead, but after a period of time we turn and look back and realize that really we were falling behind. Because everything we were doing to try to get ahead has actually served to imprison us or to trap us. At some point, the pursuit of wealth simply becomes self-fulfilling. And it causes us to live a life that most of us probably never wanted in the first place. King Solomon was the wealthiest man that ever lived. He knew something about wealth. He pursued it for a great deal of his life, and he found it unsatisfying. And he communicates to us living today, don't go through the struggle I went through. Don't go through a lifetime of chasing a dollar. Instead, learn to be content with what God has already provided, and there you will find true happiness. And I think as most of us know who have acquired any modicum of wealth, you learn pretty quickly that it takes more effort to sustain what you have earned than it did to get it in the first place. You buy that thing and all of a sudden it now becomes your owner as you work to support it, to take care of it, to keep up with it, and then only to repair and eventually replace it at some point in the future. The king here, the preacher, tells us it's a waste of time. He says that pursuing wealth simply becomes an all-consuming lifetime endeavor. Why do we want to go through the struggle? Why do we want to go through the hassle? Don't let the pursuit of wealth become the center of life, because it becomes detrimental to far more important things in life. Pursuing relationships, and specifically pursuing a relationship with God. We miss out on so many things as we struggle to make another dollar to buy another thing. And that's the subject of this text this morning. Once again, the preacher turns to address the issue of wealth, or more specifically, the pursuit of it. It's been a common theme throughout Ecclesiastes that we've dealt with several times. And as I said a moment ago, I think the reason we deal with it so much is because it's such a problem for most of us. We all struggle with money. How much is enough? Is any amount too much? Where do I draw the line? How do I figure out when my pursuit of wealth has crossed the line and that I need to pull back from? Those are some of the questions the preacher seeks to address in our text. And we're going to visit that under the theme of vain prosperity this morning. That this pursuit of wealth is a pointless one. It is a meaningless one in the grand scheme of eternal history. It is something that consumes our lives that God intended for us to be used for a relationship with Him and to advance His name and His great gospel in this world. And so the preacher is going to admonish us in this text that the pursuit of wealth really is a trap. It's one that ensnares us and one that is very difficult for us to break free from. The more we struggle to get off that hamster wheel of life, so to speak, the harder it becomes. Because the faster we spin the wheel and the more we spin it trying to get more and more and more, ever tried to get off of something that was spinning? If not, there's a merry-go-round right over here. We can go over and have an object lesson. That'd be an object lesson, wouldn't it? So you never want to try and jump off of something that's spinning fast. And he says, so a life spent pursuing wealth is a waste. It's not the purpose for which we were created, and it is not the purpose we were put on this earth. We should instead seek to find true joy in the grace of God who provides everything that we need. Can we be happy? Can we be content with what God has provided? Can we lay aside our own desires, our own wants of achieving great wealth in favor of contentment and living the life that God had planned for us? So I just want to look at those three concepts here with you this morning. The first one, the pursuit of wealth is a trap that robs us of our joy. The pursuit of wealth is a trap, and it robs us of our joy. He turns to address a reality many of us have had to learn the hard way, unfortunately. The pursuit of wealth has a tendency to become a life-consuming affair. We're taught it from a very young age, at least I was. Go earn $1 and learn the value of $1 and so forth and so on. But very quickly it moves or it morphs from just earning $1 to provide for your needs to struggling and fighting to make more and more so that you can get more stuff. And from a very young age into adulthood and even into later age, we seem to develop this appetite that is never satiated. It is one that is always there, bubbling beneath the surface. It's something that drives us to work harder, to earn more so that we can buy more things. But it's never fulfilling. There's always something more, or something new, or something greater that we want to have. And the problem with the pursuit of wealth is it always fails to deliver on its promises. It tells you that you'll be happy, you'll be secure, you'll have all of the things of your dreams, but it rarely provides any of those things, let alone all of those things. And not only does it fail to deliver on those promises, but it actually robs us of the thing that we need most, which is joy in life and peace in our circumstances. We struggle and fight and make ourselves miserable to get stuff when what God has already set before us is peace and joy that He simply wants us to walk in. And so we're on this journey that never leads anywhere productive. It simply condemns us to a life of repetition and one of struggle and one of trying to get by and to impress our neighbors. I think that was what we saw in our text last week. We do everything out of envy. We just want to look better than our neighbors. That's where we find satisfaction. And the Bible tells us that's a wrong motivation for what we do. And so here in this passage, the preacher offers 4 ways in which the pursuit of wealth robs us of our joy. The first one is, it says, it simply leaves us unsatisfied. No matter how hard we work, and even if we attain to the level that we set out to reach, we leave anyway unsatisfied. It can never deliver to us what it has promised. It never provides what we wanted in the first place, which is peace, joy, and security from our own circumstances. It never delivers the things that it promises. Notice he says in verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. So in other words, if you love money, you're never going to have enough. There'll always be a reason to make $1 more, or 10 more, 1,000 more, or 1,000,000 more. Whatever you make, whatever your income, you'll never be satisfied with what you have. It is always the desire to make more that creeps up. No matter how much of a raise you get, and how often do we hear this? If I could just get a raise, then I could get by, I could pay my bills, I could take a vacation, I could buy a new car, I could, but they never really fully materialize, do they? We get the raise, we get the thing, but it doesn't solve our circumstances. It doesn't solve our spiritual situation. It doesn't correct our emotional problems, our mental issues, our physical struggles simply to do all of this work. We get what we thought was going to make us happy, and we find it incredibly lacking. No amount of how much we get will ever improve our situation, because we always want more. Why? Why is it that we always want more? Because we believe that wealth will provide the desires of our heart. We believe it can fill that great hole in us that God placed there to be filled with Him and a relationship with others. We try and find it in possessions, or in position, or in power, or in influence, or in any number of places, but it can never deliver the thing that it promises or the desire that we have in our hearts. And this comes from a guy who was the wealthiest man to have ever lived. He had it all. He'd been there and done that, and he said, I still find this unsatisfying. He said, I built houses and kingdoms, I built gardens and vineyards, I had people to work them and to my heart's content, and I found all of these things lacking. They were nothing but vanity. They were self-serving, meaningless, and pointless. And he says, don't follow in the error of my ways. Why? Because the thing we buy simply ends up owning us. It dictates to us what we'll do and when we'll do it. Most of you are going to have to rise early tomorrow on a Monday morning and get up and go into work. Why? To pay for your stuff. I share your burden. I know what you mean. Wouldn't it be nice to have to do less of that? And the way to do less of that is to be less concerned with accumulating things. How many times do we work to pay for houses and cars and toys and vacations? We could have just figured out how to be content with the things that we already have and live that life of peace and joy we're seeking anyway. The pursuit of wealth, he says, is simply vanity. It's just meaninglessness, yet we engage in it anyway. Why? Because no matter how much we achieve, we're always going to want more, and in that, wealth becomes a trap to us. It ensnares us and puts us in a place that we can't break free from. And so it always leaves us unsatisfied. But secondly, the pursuit of wealth grieves us with more responsibilities. In other words, the more you got to maintain. The more things you have, or the more people you have working for you, or whatever it may be, the more responsibilities you now have in life. You're not only responsible for you and maybe your family, but you now become responsible for others and their well-being. And those responsibilities and the stress and the burden of all that piles up, and it gets heavier and heavier and weighs us down. He says in verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Or in other words, with increased wealth comes increased responsibility. The wealthier you become, the more people you have dependent on you. We have to understand that wealth doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? It doesn't fall down out of the sky. We don't pick it up in the morning off of the ground like manna. I don't know that any of us in here are lottery winners, right? Nobody won't hit the Publishers Clearinghouse or anything like that. Wealth doesn't occur in a vacuum. It comes as a result of hard work. And to get ahead and accumulate real wealth, it's going to depend on more than just you or more than just me. One person does not wealth accumulate. It takes a team of people. And Solomon's communicating to us here that the more we have, the more people are necessary in order to not only gain that, but to sustain that. And now our responsibility has multiplied from beyond us to others. And he says, the more you have who are dependent upon you, the greater your stress increases, the greater your responsibilities increase, and in a moment we're going to see the toll that that takes upon us. And he says, why do you want to go down that road in the first place? We shouldn't be struggling to simply bring more burdens into our lives. You know what the number one reason is that companies fail? Why they go bankrupt in the United States of America? They can't meet their payroll. They grow too big, they hire too many people, and there are too many people dependent upon that business, and they cannot meet their payroll, and therefore that business fails, and it folds. And that's true not only for businesses, and we typically think of that in terms of large corporations, but even in small businesses or individuals. The more people we have dependent upon us, the greater the struggle and the burden is going to become. And that struggle and that burden will be ever increasing. It doesn't ever go down, but it only increases and multiplies, and that's a dangerous place for us to be. Because the more we have, the more it takes to sustain it, and the more people we have depending on us, the greater then our burden to produce. We don't get to get wealthy and then work less or do less. The wealthier we become, the more we have to work. And the more hours we have to put in, and the more sacrifices we have to make in order to sustain that wealth. And Solomon all but calls us fools for getting on that merry-go-round of life. He says you're better off to never begin than to get onto this merry-go-round that you cannot get off of. And this all comes from the wealthiest man to have ever lived. He knew exactly the struggle that we are talking about this morning. He knew what it meant to be the one who had to support a multitude of people. He had an entire nation dependent upon him as king of that nation, and he knew the difficulties that were multiplied in that. The more he had and the more people there were, the more his struggle, the more the burden in his life. And he says it's not worth the effort. It's not worth the struggle that it takes. And so as we pursue this wealth, not only do we gain some income, but we gain a whole slew of responsibilities. Our lives get more complicated, more difficult, and require more sacrifices, not less. It takes more employees or more customers, or sometimes both, in order to sustain and grow that wealth. It takes more overhead, more taxes, more insurance, more of everything, doesn't it? And as those responsibilities increase, then our comfort of life decreases. There seems to be an inverse relationship with the more we work, the less joy we actually have in life, and the less free time to enjoy it. The more you have, the more you need, and then ultimately the challenge of keeping the machine going becomes a grievous burden. And that's the preacher's next point. The pursuit of wealth deprives us of our peace. The reason we set out to become wealthy in the first place is actually the thing that robs us of it. He says in verse 12, "Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep." Most of us have probably experienced that at one point or another. Laying awake at night and worrying about your stuff. How am I going to make the rent this month? How am I going to make the car payment? How am I going to put groceries on the table? How am I going to pay the doctor bill? Whatever it may be, all of us know that struggle, and we know that it is real, and those burdens and responsibilities rob us of the peace that we're seeking. We tell ourselves things like, well, if I just had more money, that would solve all of my problems. Solomon says the exact opposite is true. It will simply multiply your problems. It'll make the burdens heavier. It will make the load heavier, and the stress will increase along with it. And so as it multiplies our problems, then our peace simply evaporates. Now, the preacher touched on this in an earlier chapter we visited before. He says the one who is worrying about these things can't even sleep at night. He can't even get rest in the night. He says, sweet is the sleep of the laborer, or the one who earns today, eats today, and doesn't worry about tomorrow. He sleeps like a baby because he has nothing to be concerned about. But it's the rich man who lays awake, stressed and burdened and worrying about how he's going to meet his responsibilities. Why do we want to be that people? Why do we want to endure that struggle? The laborer has peace, but the rich man lacks it altogether. He cannot find it, and he suffers from insomnia for fear of losing everything that he has. What an incredible burden. And so we see from this there's an inverse relationship here between peace and responsibility. As the one increases, the other decreases, often exponentially. The more you have, the more it will take, and the more it will control you. And fourthly, the pursuit of wealth deceives us with false promises. Money will fix all of our problems, right? If I just had a little bit more, I could have this or have that. I could solve this problem. I could pay this bill. But it never really produces that in the end, does it? It only produces more struggle. Wealth promises us things like freedom, reward, security. But it rarely delivers on any of those things because the pursuit of wealth is a liar. It's one of the tricks of the enemy. That if you just work a little harder, sacrifice a little more, you'll reach peace and security in your life. No, you won't. Because the burden will only increase. And your stress will increase, and your life will be, as Solomon said, but a vapor. It's just chasing after the wind. It's trying to catch something that is not really there, and when you do, you have nothing to show for it. And so he warns us strongly against it. Notice here the preacher's dim view of a life consumed with the pursuit of wealth. In verse 13, he talks about how wealth brings more risk than it does reward. He says, there's a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. So in other words, wealth promises to protect us. It's going to give us security. It's going to seal us off from the seasons of life and the storms of life. But more often than not, what we end up doing is spending our lives protecting it rather than it protecting us. The fear of loss is a great thing. It's an incredible motivator for most people. Once you've attained wealth, the desire to keep it is even greater than the desire to gain it in the first place. And he warns us against that type of attitude. He calls it a grievous evil. He said it's a grievous evil that riches serve to hurt the owner rather than to help him. They're not a benefit or a blessing, but instead they can become bondage to him. And the reason for that is because wealth is more easily lost than it is gained. Far more easily lost than it is gained. There is always risk. Somebody in business or your coworker, whoever it may be, is always trying to take your place, get your raise, your promotion, and to take your stuff. And it's a danger in our lives to get into that pattern. And he warns against it. Here in the text, it was because a man got involved in a bad venture or a bad business deal. He took a risk trying to multiply or to sustain his wealth, and what it ended up doing was costing him everything. He lost it all because he was trying to gain even more. And how many of us could probably tell that same story? And so what we see then is that fear attaches here and it consumes the rich man. Now he's scared to death that he's going to lose the little bit that he does have. And he goes on here in the next section to make the point that he now has even nothing to offer to his children. He's lost it all trying to get ahead. The risk has far outweighed the reward. And he goes on in verse 13 to say, wealth brings more suffering than security. That's an interesting look at wealth, isn't it? We often tend to see it in the reverse, that it will provide security from things. But he makes the argument that it actually increases our suffering. Because wealth was supposed to provide, but the pursuit of wealth increases our loss. It increases our risk, and when it's lost, it costs those that we were charged to provide for the most. So it's not only us that is hurt in these risky adventures, in this pursuit of wealth, but it is those in our life that we have been charged to provide for. The father in our story had nothing to offer his son. That's not an overstatement. He lost it all. He had nothing left to provide his own children. His attempt to gain more, his attempt to provide material security for himself had actually cost him the ability to provide anything to his offspring. He couldn't put the groceries on the table because of this desire, because of this compulsion to make more money and to sustain more money. He got in such a dangerous situation that it was actually going to cost his family. And so the security wealth promises often evaporates into suffering for those involved. I'll give you as an example, ever known anybody that's won the lottery? Ever watched a news story about people who win the lottery? Their lives fall apart. There's incredible suffering that attaches with sudden wealth like that. People don't know how to handle it. People come out of the woodwork trying to get some of it. And their lives are often destroyed. Suffering is what they reap from those winnings rather than the security they thought that it would provide. And Solomon's wise here in offering to us, in admonishing us that this pursuit of wealth is a danger not only to a few, but a danger to all of us. Often we have a tendency when we think somebody says wealth, well, he's not talking about me. I don't have any wealth. But Solomon's not he's not creating layers of wealth here. He's not saying this is only for the ultra wealthy, the top 10% or 1% or whatever it may be. He's saying this is a temptation to every single one of us, to always wanting to attain to the next level and to make sacrifices we shouldn't make in order to get there. And he warns us about this struggle. He wants us to understand it is not worth the effort that we're putting in. And then he says, as if all suffering weren't enough, we're left with this final consolation. At the end of the day, you can't take it with you. So you've wasted your entire life pursuing wealth, trying to accumulate things that cannot provide what you hoped they would provide in the first place. And at the end of the day, you die and you can't take any of it with you. What a consolation, huh? He says in verse 15, as he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again. Naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil, that he may carry away in his hand. In other words, we brought nothing into this world, and we'll take nothing with us. We thought wealth would bring us joy and security and provide all of the things that we wanted and needed. But Solomon says it's only an illusion. It's only an illusion, like a mirage in a desert, something we see from afar, and we think if I can only make it there, but it never materializes because the closer you get to it, it tends to just evaporate into thin air. He's making that argument about the pursuit of wealth. It's a trap that not only didn't provide, but it's also robbed us of the joy of living. So not only has it not provided what it said it would, but now it has taken something from us, the joy that we should have enjoyed in living life that God has provided to us. God didn't set us up and put us in this world to endure a life of misery. Particularly the Christian life was never designed to be one of drudgery. God expects for and desires for us to be happy when we live out what he has commanded in his word to do. And he offers all of us these admonitions and these commands in Scripture, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, not because he wants to control us, but because he knows what will truly lead to happiness. And he knows that this pursuit of wealth can become a life-consuming one that will persist forever and rob us of the joy that he wanted for us. And then next we see that life is then wasted if spent on the pursuit of wealth. It actually becomes a waste of our life in verse 16. He says, this also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, and in much vexation and sickness and anger. So as we came, so shall we go. We brought nothing into the world, and we'll take nothing with us. And so then what we see is that what we do in between is what truly matters. How we use this life that God has given to us. Will we use it to advance his cause? To come into a relationship with the Lord? Will we use it living a life of contentedness and a life of joy and peace in the Lord? Or will we continue in this struggle of the world? It's an implied question that the preacher is asking here. He's saying this, you have a decision to make. You have a choice to make which way you're going to go. Are you going to follow the ways of the world and end up like he has just enumerated for us in these verses? Or will you instead follow what God has commanded and find true joy in life, true peace in life, and true security? And the preacher is admonishing us to choose the right course here. He's again making a point here that a life spent pursuing wealth, which can't be taken with us when we die anyway, is a pointless exercise. And he says it robs us of the joy of life with the words he says, and he eats in darkness. The rich man eats in darkness. What does he mean by that? He doesn't mean he can't afford to pay the electric bill. He means he's all alone. He's spent a lifetime accumulating wealth, and all of his relationships have evaporated. He's suffered loss. He can't provide for his children. His family has left him. He's all alone now. And who among us would want to end up in that position in the end of life? Solomon says, be very careful in the choice that you make here. This path leads to joy and peace in the Lord. This path leads to destruction and distress. And be careful which one you choose, because the one spent pursuing wealth is a wasted life. Not only is it pointless, but he says it actually increases our suffering. Notice those words he uses in verse 17. His life is consumed with vexation, sickness, and anger. Does that sound pleasant? I don't think so. Vexation, or in other words, gloom. His life is one of depression. It is one of gloom. It is one of anger. We know what that means. Probably anger at loss or anger at missed objectives, missed goals, and so forth and so on. These are the things that consume his life. Vexation and sickness. I think sickness he doesn't so much have in mind physical ailments as he does despair. We're sick in the mind. We're sick in the soul because this pursuit of wealth has consumed our life. And as we turn around nearing the end of our life and look back, we realize we have nothing to show for it. It produced nothing. It gained us nothing, but only suffering, gloom, and anger. Like represents, it doesn't produce happiness or joy or security. So what's the lesson for us? We shouldn't fill our life with a pursuit of wealth. It can't deliver the things that we want anyway. It is only going to multiply our suffering. So instead, we have to do this thing. Here's the third thing, the final thing, and here's the good part. And when we've been through these texts in Ecclesiastes before, the preacher has to take us down to the bottom before he brings us back up, which is what he does here in verse 18. He says, true joy is found in the grace of God. You're not going to find it in the pursuit of wealth. You're not going to find it in the things of this world. It is only found in enjoying the grace of God that he has given to you. Verse 18, he says, behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. And so verse 18 speaks of finding contentment, peace, joy, happiness. Those are the things that we need to be looking for, and we need to be looking to the source of those things. It's not our own effort. It's not the material possessions we have accumulated, but rather it is the grace of God in our lives that has provided us the things that we need. He says the problem is we're essentially looking in the wrong place. We think things will meet our needs, will satisfy our deepest needs, will fulfill our desires. Solomon argues it's only in enjoying God himself and the grace that he has put into our life. All of these, he argues, are not found in the pursuit of wealth, but in enjoying the grace of God. Enjoy is an important word in the Bible. It often talks about how our relationship with God is not to be one of drudgery or misery or difficulty like so many human relationships, but to be one of joy. To love who God is and what he has done for us. To enjoy what he has provided and what he has done for us. We often are people who are undeserving of the grace of God. Grace simply meaning unmerited favor from God. We are often undeserving of that, but fortunately for us, God blesses us anyway. God makes his rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike, the Bible says. God gives us a blessing we can neither earn nor do we deserve. And we need to learn to appreciate that. The question becomes, is wealth in and of itself wrong? I think the answer to that is no. The Bible's not telling us it's wrong to be wealthy. It's saying the pursuit of it is such a danger that we should avoid it. God chooses to bless some very richly, very lavishly, and that's according to the will and purpose of God. But to others he withholds some. That is also according to the will and purpose of God. But he says we need to learn to be content in whatever circumstances God has placed us. Wealthy or poor or anywhere in between, we need to learn to be content in every circumstance. Because when we're not, it communicates back to God that we're not happy with what God has provided. We are looking for satisfaction in something other than him, and that's a dangerous place to be. This is his lot, refers to the providence of God. How did we end up in the position or station of life we're in? God has placed us there. And we need to recognize that even though we may not always understand why God has placed us where he has, it is always to our benefit. God knows what we need most and has placed us in the place he wants us to be. So, does that mean we shouldn't work hard? No, it doesn't. We should work hard and we should enjoy the toil and the fruits of our labors, but we need to be careful about not letting that becoming the all-consuming thing in life. Instead, we need to simply enjoy what God has provided rather than trying to alter our circumstances. We shouldn't seek to alter those circumstances at the cost of what God has called us to do and has invited us to be and do. We need to learn to be content in him and with the things that he has provided. We don't want to get to the situation where we look back at the end of life and see that we have wasted what God has entrusted to us. We don't want to look back on life and see that we accumulated dollars and things and stuff, but we have lost the relationships that are important to us. I'm sorry. What did you say? Oh, sorry. I didn't realize you all had gone back there. I'm almost done. So none of us want to look back on that life and think, why did we waste it pursuing wealth? Why did we spend our life chasing a dollar when God had more important things in life for us? He wanted a relationship with us. He has blessed us with so many things that we should be enjoying day in and day out. We should have a perspective where we look at the things that God has provided as a blessing and a benefit, not as something that has fallen short. So many of us look at life and we think, well, why can't I get ahead? Why can't I have this or have that or do this or do that? And instead we should see it for the blessing that it is. I'll point to an illustration. About 150 years ago, there was a man by the name of Charles Adams. He was a politician and a diplomat in the 1800s. The only reason you're going to remember him is probably for the story I'm getting ready to tell you. Charles Adams was a prolific diary keeper, a prolific diary writer. And after he died, historians had gone through his diary and found an entry on a certain day. And it said in that entry, "Today I went fishing with my son. What a waste of a day." But his son, Brooke, was also a prolific diary keeper. And upon his death, historians went through his book and they found an entry on the same day that said, "Went fishing with my dad today. The best day ever." So it's an issue and a question of perspective. How we look at life, how we look at the things of life, what God has provided to us. Are we looking at our lives and our circumstances and our material possessions, and are we thinking, boy, God sure didn't bless me very much? Or are we looking at the things we have in life and seeing them for the blessing that they truly are? That God has blessed us richly beyond our own imaginations. Because it could be far worse, couldn't it? There are many who are suffering at a far lower level than you and I ever will. And we need to learn to take the proper approach to the blessings of God and the grace of God in our lives. He loves us. He cares for us. He provides for us. He wants us to be happy. He wants us to enjoy the blessings and the benefits of life. But he also expects us to appreciate these things for what they are. Not to look back at God like a spoiled child and say, I want more, or I want another one. But instead to appreciate these things for the blessing that they are. Notice here in verse 19, "Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is a gift of God." If we can appreciate our circumstances as the blessing of God that they are, we will never suffer. We'll never be miserable. We'll never be unsatisfied. We'll never be unfulfilled if we appreciate what God has already provided. The preacher is essentially saying here, work hard as is fitting in the Lord and enjoy the blessings he provides. Enjoy what he's provided. Don't simply skip over it looking to get more. Find contentment where you are, because the alternative is detrimental to us. It destroys our life and it consumes our life. And we need to recognize, if you haven't already, there's comfort in contentment. It eliminates the struggle, the worry, the fear when we become content with our circumstances. There's joy to be had if we'll simply accept God's grace as the blessing that it is. And then we can say with the preacher, as he does in verse 20, "For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart." When you find contentment, you don't worry about your life. You don't look back on it with regret, because you're so consumed with the joy of the Lord throughout your life, you don't have time and it doesn't cross your mind. Contentment brings comfort in this life. Nothing else does. No matter the amount of wealth you may accumulate, again, this text written by the wealthiest man that had ever lived, wealth will never provide what it promises. Only God can do that. And so we see that suffering and anguish in this life evaporate in the face of the joy of the Lord. They simply disappear or pale in comparison. And as I was studying this text this week, There was another verse that kept coming to mind. It's almost as if the preacher was prefiguring the words of Jesus in Matthew 6:33. He said there, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these other things, all this other stuff that you worry about day in and day out, that will be added to you as well. He said, don't worry about your house, your car, what you drive, what you own, who you are, what position you have. All those things that we human beings worry about. He says, you don't worry about that. You seek first his kingdom, and all the rest of the stuff's going to take care of itself. You find contentment and joy in the Lord, the rest of this stuff ceases to matter. And that's the preacher's call to all of us, is to find contentment and joy in the Lord. How do I do that? That's what our invitation is about today. If we're going to find contentment and joy in the Lord, it begins with a relationship with the Lord. It doesn't just happen on its own. It doesn't just happen organically. The Bible calls upon us to recognize that we as human beings are separated from God because of our sin. That God created us holy and perfect, the first man and woman anyway, and he placed them in the garden, but they very quickly sinned and fell out of relationship with God. And the rest of the story of the Bible has been a recapitulation of all of the suffering that ensued as a result of that. Sin came into the world and it broke our relationship with God. If we want to get back to having one with him, being restored to God, and finding that joy and contentment that the preacher is talking about in our text, we need to correct our relationship with God. And the Bible tells us that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the wages of that sin is death. That God is just in punishing us for the sin that we commit. But it also tells us that God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son into the world to die for us. And that those who believe in him will have an everlasting life. In other words, he sent Jesus into the world to take the penalty for the sin that you and I committed. We want to find joy and contentment in the Lord. We need a reconciled relationship with the Lord first. And that only happens because of the sacrifice of Christ. So as you consider what you've heard this morning, is your first step to correct that relationship? That's the message that I leave you with. What would you now do? You've heard the truth. God calls upon you to make a response. What would you now do? Let's pray.